It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Kidada E. Williams. She's an associate professor of history at Wayne State University, author of her second book. I believe it's her second, right? I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's just start. I mean, the phrasing of war, the war against Reconstruction, is an attempt by you to as a corrective for the way that we often talk about Reconstruction, and certainly, prior to 20 some odd years ago, almost exclusively perceived Reconstruction as a function of the Dunning School. Tell us a little bit about the Dunning School. I mean, I think, this audience is fairly well versed, but let's just go over this because I think this is important and why this is a corrective.
Well, what the Dunning School essentially does is takes up the argument made by ex-Confederates after they overthrew Reconstruction. And what they said is that Reconstruction failed. And the sort of larger part of that story is that they said, they were unfairly punished for starting the war. White Northerners put unqualified, ignorant Black people in control of the South, and those Black people harmed white people. And so white Southerners had no choice but to overthrow this unjust government, and do that with the Ku Klux Klan, and then install the system of Jim Crow. So that's the narrative that ex-Confederates created. And the Dunning School essentially turns that into, or plays a role in helping that become like the major narrative, the major propaganda of U.S. history after the Civil War. And so what I wanted to do was I understood that that was the narrative that people got. I understood that that was the story that some historians are telling, or it's part of a shorthand that historians are using even today. But those historians who are using that narrative of failure today, what they mean when you press them on it, they mean the federal government failed to protect African Americans' rights. But if they're not explicit when they say Reconstruction failed, then the larger public is filling in the gaps with that narrative from Reconstruction. And they believe that civil rights, equality, the vote, et cetera, were wasted on Black people.
And I should just say, the Dunning School came out of Columbia. Dunning, his first name escapes me, but it was William Dunning. And there were other historians sort of in his sphere out of Columbia, and I imagine other schools. But this is in the 1920s, which is not really a coincidence in terms of that era. We'll catch up to that. But I have to say that, over the past, 6, 7, 8 years, on this program, I've come to understand Reconstruction in a way that I barely even heard about it in high school. I mean, it really was not even, I don't even know if I actually ever heard about it in high school. Even in college, it was, at that time in the 80s, it was barely spoken of in any way. And then this notion of failure also, by the time it gets to a broader audience, like you say, there's such a passive quality to it that it almost is like, it's almost as like it just didn't catch. But over the years, we've heard so much from different historians about the coups that took place here. What you've done is actually gone in and found the records of families' testimony, so that it takes it right down to sort of like where the rubber meets the road with these things. Let's talk about where these sources for these records. The most prominent was a series, I guess the official title was the Joint Select Committee to Inquire on the Condition of Affairs in Late Insurrectionist States. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it's basically, though, it was like talking, and this happened in 1871. So give us the context of what led to that, because I think it becomes clear through your work here that the story of the Civil War ending and it ends, and some people are mad about it, some people are not. It really just is more of a story of like the war shifts to almost like a guerrilla war.
Right. So part of what happens is that wars never end as neatly in real life as they appear in history books, right? And so what we get is that the war ended. And what we don't acknowledge is that wars are often followed by new conflicts. And, I think the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq should tell us about what happens when the war is officially over and like what happens afterwards. So after the Civil War, the new conflict is about African Americans enjoying these civil and political rights. And I think we need to understand that because ex-Confederates and enslavers only released Black people from bondage in order to end the war, right? So it's not something that they want to do. It's not something that they do happily. And what we see is them immediately shift to trying to hold on to as much of slavery as possible. And some of this looks like killing, slaughtering people who are trying to leave farms and plantations, killing Black veterans when they return from the battlefield to go get their families out of bondage. They often have to fight their way in order to recover their people who were legally, technically free. But that's because you've got those former enslavers who are still holding on to slavery. And so what they do is they start to declare essentially war on Black people who are seizing their freedom. And so the difference that we have to understand is that while Black people were in bondage, it wasn't profitable to just kill them all willy-nilly, right? You can continue sort of using different types of violence against them, but you weren't going to kill them. In an era where they're legally free, they have rights, and they're acting on those rights, you can turn on them and massacre them at will. And so that's part of what we see in terms of that war that I argue follows the Civil War. And what we have are African Americans reporting this violence to Army officials, to the Freedmen's Bureau. They're writing members of Congress. They're contacting the president. They're like letting their state officials know. They're reporting it to anyone who would listen. And these dispatches continue making their way up the chain of command. And eventually, you get members of Congress who say, we need to look at what's happening here. Even the generals are reporting that there's a lot of violence going on. And so what Congress decides is to form a joint select committee to investigate what was happening, to investigate these claims. And that's how you get this testimony. You've got about a dozen or so lawmakers from both chambers of Congress who head to these spots in the South, and they hear testimonies from elected officials, law enforcement, accused perpetrators, and their victims.
Yeah, I don't know if you get this from other people, but it's almost embarrassing to me that it is so revelatory to contemplate the post Civil War in the way that, we've seen the violence continue in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and this it just so on some level, it just occurs to me, of course this is what it was, but we're not conditioned, and it's almost probably because we haven't had a war in this country in 170 years now, whatever the math is. And, there's not a lot of people around who can tell that story. But basically it's they're giving up their slaves because the plantation owners are giving up their slaves because they're on the wrong end of a gun. But then because we don't occupy, by we, I mean the Union Army does not occupy the South, they take their guns and they go home, and then they're like, okay. And I got to imagine too that the assassination of Abraham Lincoln gave a hope of you know what? This ain't over yet. We can turn this around. So this wasn't just acting out. It was we have a new agenda here and we can get back to where we were.
Exactly. And having President Johnson secede Abraham Lincoln, they essentially, the former enslaving class, they say he's one of ours. He's a former enslaver himself.
He was.
Right?
Yeah.
He's one of our people. And his moves initially, when he comes into power, makes clear that there's going to be no consequence for secession, that they're going to get their land back. The one thing they won't get back is slavery. And so what they say is that, we may not be able to get it back in the exact form as we had it before, But what we'll do is we will try to do as much as we can to resurrect this old system. And that's essentially what they're able to do. And as you know, because of the lack of military occupation, you do have some forces within the U.S. South, but one of the realities you have to deal with is that the war is officially over. Americans dating back to the Boston Massacre don't take well to a standing army in peacetime. And so you've got a lot of people who are saying, well, the war is over, so we shouldn't have a standing army. The soldiers want to go home. There are all of these things, and there's a political investment in moving on from the war. So the army's footprint is shrinking every single year. And so there are never enough troops in the region and where the violence is happening in order for them to do anything about the violence. And ex-Confederates are strategic. They're not striking in areas where there are large numbers of troops.
And I want to get to those strikes too, but it also sort of like, it also contextualizes like the value of maintaining some ambiguity in the context of the 15th Amendment, in the context of the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment. Though that ambiguity, if it's seen in part as like, this war is not over, like we can't have exactly what we had before, but we can have the same sort of like structure. And like you say, they're avoiding the conflict. It's a guerrilla war they're fighting, essentially against freed Black people and their political power. So give us, I just want one more on how the committee forms, and then we'll get into sort of the substance of what initiated that, because we're talking 6 years after the official end of the Civil War. That committee, is that with Johnson sort of stifling, any of the sort of like real, I guess, more dramatic things that the radical Republicans want to do. This committee feels like, well, this is the power that we have and we're going to exercise it. And they actually go, this is not a committee that happens in Washington. This is a fact-finding committee that tell us a little bit about that. And then we'll get into some of these stories and what was the impetus for these committees.
Right. So, you've got lawmakers who go to places like Jacksonville, Mississippi. They go to Spartanburg, South Carolina, Jacksonville, Florida, I should say, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Macon, Mississippi. They go to Atlanta. So they go to these places that are in the South to collect these testimonies. And I think the thing we have to keep in mind is that you've got not only both chambers, but members of both parties who go to the South. And so you've got progressives, some abolitionists, moderates, and white conservatives in the North and West. So they often go, everyone's kind of going with their own agenda because they had fought in the process of establishing the committee about who was going to be able to go, what they were investigating. And you can look at the congressional record to see where people stand, because there are a lot of members of Congress who don't believe the violence is happening. So they're essentially, there's nothing that generals can tell them about the violence that's happening that will convince them, because they're invested as white conservatives in a very particular kind of post-Reconstruction, a post-Civil War reconstruction of the nation. And so there's nothing that they will hear that will convince them that white Southerners are targeting Black people. And we see that in the questions they ask, we see that in the report that they write, et cetera. So you do have a very diverse group of lawmakers who go south to investigate the violence that's happening.
Okay, and so what was the impetus for, like, I imagine that cohort of lawmakers you're talking about is sort of like, I don't know, if they had put Jim Jordan on the impeachment committee for Trump. I mean, his job would be to be an obstacle to the committee doing its work. What was the impetus, though, for the committee? So I know why the Jim Jordans of that era would have gone on that roadshow. What was the impetus, though? Like, it was just that they were hearing from different, and what was the agenda beyond taking the record? Like, What was the thinking of the lawmakers as to like how we're going to apply this information?
Right. So I think part of what we have is they're getting a steady stream of reports. And one dimension of the reports is not only just that they are deliberately targeting Black people, but they are interfering with elections. And so they are interfering with the democratic process. And there's the belief that if they are disrupting elections, if they are denying people the right to vote, that they must take action, that Congress must take action in order to address this. And in reality, in assassinating voters at the polls, in assassinating lawmakers, in attacking people for trying to vote, in trying to bribe elected officials to leave office and then trying to assassinate them if they refuse, that there is clear disorder in the election process. And so the idea is that if they will go and they can collect this information and understand what's really happening, that maybe they can bolster the number of troops in the region in order to secure the elections that are happening in the South as those governments reconstruct themselves.
What do we have? Like, I'm right now, I just, and it really came from like a listener, sent me, a list of what we know in terms of like massacres that took place. I mean, we've talked about on this program, the Wilmington, massacres. I think we've talked about, Colfax and, Tulsa and a couple others. We don't even really know how many there were. And by massacres, we're talking like could be hundreds, could be 25. I mean, it is, I would imagine too, like the efficacy of this thing is if they can kill that guy and that guy, we're not safe. Yeah. Like if they can kill the guy who was mayor or, state rep, they can certainly kill me. And so I'm either going to, chilling effect is almost not even the word, but do we have any like real sense in the documents, in the testimony that's there? Do we start to hear more numbers than the historical record has? Because I imagine there are a lot of places where this stuff dies out because nobody's talking about it. Nobody reports it. Maybe, Black families leave and they don't talk about it, or if they do, it gets lost in over the generations. Do we have a good sense of like how many people were killed during these 5 or 6 years in this form of violence?
So the truth of the matter is that we don't. And for the reasons that you explained, like we've got the major massacres like that happened in Memphis and that happened in New Orleans. But what you have are a lot of mass killing events. And so no one's necessarily doing the counting. The people who may be witnesses are killed and they're driven off. We do have, and a lot of Union military officials are saying there are too many to count. We don't know. And that's as early as 1868. They're saying there are too many to count. And we know this violence continues clear up until Wilmington. And so we do have one figure, and that's by Robert Smalls. He was an enslaved man who escaped during the Civil War, and he served in the army, and then he goes to become a lawmaker. And in the late 1890s, he estimates that there are about 54,000 killed.
Wow.
From the end of the Civil War through the late 1890s. And we have no idea how he came up with that figure. But when you talk to historians who are looking at the records and you're like, mass killing here, mass killing there, the EJI has come up with 2,000 during that short period. And that's of what they're calling lynchings. That's not including all of the other kinds of violence that resulted in death and that injury and then death. And so when you look at all of the records and you look at this, the sort of period of time, you can say, we don't know how he came up with that figure, but it kind of tracks. It would be like very surprising to find him completely wrong. Now, he may have been looking at reports that were coming in to the Department of Justice. He may have been gathering all of his data from a lot of Black organizations like the Colored Conventions that were meeting every year. And in these convention records, you've got that regular reports from local communities about how many people had been killed. So again, we don't know exactly how he came up with this figure, but we know that it's definitely in the thousands. during Reconstruction, and especially if you track Reconstruction to the end of the 19th century, the number is significantly larger.
Right. I mean, so the Wilmington massacre essentially takes place in 1898 in North Carolina, and you're basically looking at almost like a 30-year war, like a 30-year. I don't know what, it's not a Cold War, it's not necessarily a hot war. It's like almost like a guerrilla war essentially waged across this, and the feds are nowhere to be seen except for in that 1871 hearings. And what comes out of those hearings, well, let's get to that in a moment. Let's talk about a little bit about what you found and from different families. I don't know if there's a couple of stories that whether it's like the Crosby family or the Tutson family or which, but maybe tell us a story of one or two of those families that give us a sense of like the range of how things were, this war of intimidation, I guess, or attempt to recapture some form of slavery.
So I'll start with the Tutsons in Florida. At the end of the war, they managed to work hard, save up their money, and they get on a homestead. And as soon as they get onto the land, their white neighbors try to drive them off of it. And what they say is, we have rightful access to this land. We have worked hard. We've done what we're supposed to do. We're not leaving it. So they had been offered bribes. They'd been intimidated. And the wife, Hannah Tutson, says, we're not leaving our land. And, she says, I don't care what they do to me as long as we keep our land. We've worked too hard for this. And so they're committed to not leaving. And one night, in the middle of the night, a group of armed white men burst into their home. They're there with their 3 children, and it's Hannah and Samuel, her husband, and they're there with their 3 young children. And it is like a home invasion. They are not prepared to be attacked. They are not prepared to defend themselves. They are quickly overpowered. Their toddler is thrown across the room, and the adults are dragged out to 2 separate locations, tied to trees and whipped and beaten and tortured, and Hannah Tutson is sexually assaulted. Their children flee from the home in terror and go and hide in the woods. The older daughter, she plies the baby, who's like a toddler, with blackberries to try to keep it from crying out and making noises so the men will hear them and find them. And the men tear down their home. They knock down their fences. They destroy everything they've built. And then they eventually leave. And so that example, the Tutsons, they weren't doing anything to harm anyone. They weren't even necessarily voting. They were just making the most of freedom like they were supposed to. They got land. They were working the land. Hannah was working as a washerwoman, and they were attacked in order to take their property from them and to leave them with nothing. And I think in the minds of the perpetrators, it's so that Black people had nothing. They had no choice but to go back to a condition that was very similar to slavery. And so that's just one example.
And I mean, there's a couple of things I feel like that we can infer from this. That one is that this, the next plot of land owned by a Black family, all they need to say is like, you don't want to end up like the Tutsons.
Yes.
And so those people leave. It has that efficacy. And I also got to imagine that for every family like the Tutsons who is willing to testify publicly, there has to be, I don't know what the algorithm is, but X number of other families who went through the exact same thing, who are afraid, like, I'm not testifying. It's going to put a target on my back. It's going to put a target on my, like, I mean, the bravery associated. I mean, that's the amazing thing about this is like the bravery associated with even testifying. I would, like, I guess maybe it's just sort of some notion we can trust them because they're feds, maybe. But do we have any notion of like if there was retribution on people who testified?
There absolutely was. Some people were attacked on their way to testifying before Congress. Other people, they were attacked and driven from their communities or even killed afterwards. And there are reports in subsequent congressional investigations into violence and other activity in the South that reveal, the danger that people are in. People really, they are clear in understanding that testifying before the hearings or testifying before the committee puts their lives and their family lives in danger. But for a lot of the bravest witnesses, what they say is they can't imagine the alternative. Not trying to get justice leaves them open to future attacks. It leaves their neighbors and maybe other relatives in their community open to future attacks. So they're putting their lives on the line with the hope that they can convince lawmakers to take purposeful action to end the violence so that everyone can be free, equal, and secure.
And we should say that, these hearings are happening close enough to the end of the war that it's almost as if there's still sort of like some hope, like you don't know which way this trajectory is going. And we don't know how durable the desire of the plantation owner class and others, I guess, to subjugate Black people, how durable that is, and how durable the federal government will be or not be in that instance. Do you want to talk about maybe the Crosby family as well? I mean, just to give a sense of two different stories, and then we can go and talk about what came out of these hearings.
Right. So the Crosby family, they live just outside of Aberdeen, Mississippi. And Edward, he is working, but he wants to get ahead. And he realizes that the best way to do that is to be able to vote into office people who will serve his interests. But he's still living on the land of the person or the family that held him in bondage. And so, he's planning on voting, he's planning on exercising his rights. And his former enslaver says, if you vote away white men's power in this election, we're going to kill you. And so in this exchange, it's very clear, right? Edward is worried that he may lose his life. They may be evicted and so put out on the streets. So he tells, his former enslaver, now his landlord and employer, well, yes, of course, I hear you. I will not vote away your rights. And so he goes to vote. He says, he's smart. He knows what to say in this meeting. But he decides to act in his own interest in the election. And he goes to try to vote. And he's told that there are no Republican ballots available. And so he's walking around thinking, well, I know there should be ballots. They know that this is an election. So he goes to another polling place and he's told the exact same thing. And he meets up with a group of other Black men who are told the exact same thing. They've gone from polling place to polling place. And soon there are armed white men who start to surround the polling places. And what the Black men know is that if they take any action, if they try to demand a ballot, that they may all be killed. And so Edward says, I knew I was beat at my own game. And so he went home. And so he went home, but one night he steps out in the middle of the night to get some water for his child. And he feels and he hears the rumble of what turns out to be a team of horses coming towards his home. And it is white men in Klan masks, and their horses are even draped with cloth, coming to punish Edward for trying to vote in the election. And so he runs and he hides in the smokehouse, thinking that the men won't search the property. And if they do, they'll never think to go into the smokehouse. And his wife tells them when they get down from their horses that he's not there. And so the white men give up their search for Edward, but he knows that he's been marked. And he doesn't necessarily want to leave the community. He may want to leave the person who held him in bondage, but he doesn't necessarily want to leave the community because his support network is there. And he also knows it'll be very hard to convince other landlords and employers to hire him if he was planning on voting. So he believes that if he testifies before Congress, he can maybe convince lawmakers to help lawmakers see something that he knows, which is that enslavers are doing what they can to hold on to slavery, and they're doing what they can to overthrow Reconstruction. And he really wants, for a sense of his own self-regard and value for his life and the future of his family, he wants to let lawmakers know, because he hopes and believes that a government that would abolish slavery would make sure that Black people have the ability to enjoy their freedom.
I mean, it's amazing when you just hear these two different stories of these two different families. Like, you can see through the years, the 100 and, I guess 40, 50 years, you can see the different sort of variations. If the Civil War was sort of like the most violent attempt to maintain this type of structure in society, you just start to see, as you go forward in time, these other iterations are versions of the earlier ones, but just within the constraints of that time. So the, covenants to keep Black families from living in a certain area in Long Island are the version of throwing them off the land and beating them until they leave. Right. And then, making mortgage loans less accessible is just in the other iteration. And then we get into just more sophisticated segregation as we go through time. And we can see the same thing with the voting. We're going to first come to you and tell you, if you vote, we're going to kill you. And then we're going to pretend like we've run out of ballots. And then we're going to have poll taxes. And then when those get, in literacy tests, when those get rescinded, then we're just going to put a series of other obstacles that are more sort of like subtle and with the same agenda, maybe not as effective as saying, I'm going to kill you, but with the same intent. So following these hearings, or is it simultaneously, there's a passage of the Enforcement Acts, which is like, it's just a reminder, we have laws, you should really enforce them. It's more or less what it, but it's also known as the KKK Act. And I think this also, what your work here does, is it makes it clear that the KKK is not like some entity distinct from I don't want to say it's distinct from the Confederate Army, but it's almost like this is just sort of the guerrilla warfare version of the Confederate Army.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Talk about the Enforcement Acts.
Right. So what the Enforcement Acts do is they become a mechanism for trying to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And so it's very clear, there are clear indications that ex-Confederates are acting to deny Black people their freedom, including their release from bondage, that they are denying them due process of law and equal protection under the law. So when Black people report this violence to local authorities, what the records reveal, and even, members of the Freedmen's Bureau and U.S. Army personnel are saying, there is no justice for Black people within the legal system in the Southern states. None at all. Right now. And they're clearly trying to violate not only Black men's right to vote, but their ability to serve in office after they've been elected. And so what the Ku Klux Klan Act and what the larger Enforcement Acts try to do is to try to address the destabilization and the undermining of the democratic process in terms of elections. So it does things like it makes it there's a greater chance of it being a federal crime to interfere with an election. It's a crime to wear masks, et cetera, to the polls, et cetera, trying to intimidate people away from voting. So it becomes it's one of many mechanisms that could be used to try to tamp down on this violence. What we also see with the Enforcement Act is the larger, what will become the Department of Justice investigation into this violence. And so you get agents sent south to investigate what's happening with these elections and what's happening in terms of the violence. And they're sending a lot of this information back to DC, letting them know that this is what's happening and this is why we need action to be taken in order to retain the integrity of American elections.
The problem was that the Enforcement Acts, in many respects, were just simply not enforced.
Yes.
I mean, there was just no apparatus to enforce it, really.
Yes. And but also not by design. I should say, but kind of by design. In the sense that if there had been the will to enforce these acts,
right,
then that could have happened. And I think that's important to sort of acknowledge, because it's not only members of Congress. Because Congress in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they add enforcement clauses in each one of the amendments, and Congress has the power and authority to enforce this act or enforce this amendment. But lawmakers don't act. And one of the main reasons lawmakers don't act is because of their own investments in white supremacy and their own concerns about what the end of slavery means. And they're responding to their constituents, the white majority in the North and West, who also have, they've got their own sort of quibbles and concerns with emancipation and what equal rights actually means. So the power to enforce the amendments is there. Congress just doesn't really act on them until the 1960s.
I mean, this is, it's also instructive, just like broadly speaking, on how how government, not even just ours, I would imagine, but all work, right? Like they're taking all of these steps which diffuse, let's say, the outrage, yes, the impetus to act upon them. They're taking all these steps that diffuse them. Obviously, like they sent a lot of agents down. I think like thousands of agents down to record this stuff. So the stuff was pretty meticulously recorded. But that act lets a little air out of the tire. And then by the time it gets back into the point where you need more pressure, there's just not the will in the North at that point. Like, we did a war over this. How much more do we need to do? I mean, like, we were just talking about child poverty. We cut child poverty by 40% in the past year. And yet, there's not enough will amongst the constituents who would push the parties, I should say, right, the politicians to continue this program, which it's clearly we can do it. It can be done.
Right.
It really doesn't take that much. It doesn't take that much. And but there's just not the will to push it. So we take this through, and I know this is sort of goes beyond the scope of this book, maybe, but this progresses, this dynamic progresses. And despite what we hear early on, that was almost, the last thing you hear in terms of someone who's drowning, right? The last, to the extent that they're making it, that's it. That's the biggest noise that we have. And it slowly, it takes over and really doesn't end until we get into Jim Crow, which is basically we successfully stopped, Reconstruction from changing the dynamics so dramatically in our society. And now we're going to codify our position and entrench that through Jim Crow laws, which begin as that era ends, right? I mean, that's what's happening.
Right. And they also install the monuments to celebrate their victory, right?
Well, that seems to happen almost in phase 2 of Jim Crow, almost, is to edify, we were able to stop the Black political power and wealth from happening,
yes,
in its nascent stages over the course of 20, 30 years. We then simultaneously also codify these results in Jim Crow laws. And we have a Supreme Court that's going to back it up. We have Plessy versus Ferguson. We also have a whole host of rulings on voting, so that we've now institutionalized this. And then we're going to culturally sort of signify this by the teens and the 20s, where the KKK, which was, really the guerrilla bands of the Confederate Army, now numbered 6%, card carrying, the out KKK, 6% of the country at that point. What ends it? Obviously Jim Crow laws don't end to the 1960s, but it feels is it just World War II and then and the Depression, and does that, or is it just well, we've achieved a stasis that we're happy with. We've got our new equilibrium. We're good with that. And we don't need to push anything more.
I think that they had managed to completely subjugate the Black population in the South. I think the other thing they managed to do was to take control over how the history was taught. Right?
This is when the Dunning School happens at
Exactly.
the same time that we're getting these statues, essentially.
Exactly. So you've got the lost cause narrative. You've got the sort of daughters of the Confederacy taking over the education it's sort of like in the larger public schools, taking over the textbooks, et cetera, and then casting Reconstruction as a failure, right? One that, who needs to study a failure? Why pay any attention to it? And so you've got this sort of, they feel victory to a degree, but they also recognize that hegemony is hard work, that it requires constant vigilance. And it requires constant vigilance because Black people will not surrender their rights. They will not consistently, they will not lay down and not continue fighting for their rights. And so that's why you see, even through this period, a lot of Black people suing in court. They're, migrating, they're participating in the great migrations out of the South. They are looking at the country sideways when the nation says in World War I and World War II, are you Black people going to help? And Black people are like, why should we? And so, I feel like the white population feels like they have control over the situation, but they realize that they don't, right? And that's why you see more and more that sort of blossoming of civil rights activism, and they feel like they have to tamp down even more in order to limit Black people's ability to try to fight their way out of the system. And so what eventually starts to happen is that you get more and more support, more moderate support for what will become civil rights and support for, at least in theory, a more just society. And that momentum, you see the rise of the civil rights movement. But as the civil rights movement is occurring, you've got the sort of white Southern conservative movement that is on the rise too, that is determined to tear down everything that had been achieved during a civil rights movement, very much like their predecessors had done with Reconstruction.
I mean, and so in many respects, the sort of like the conservative movement we see today, particularly as it manifests itself in a lot of these former Confederate states, is it's just a continuation of that and reacting to different facts on the ground, because it was a 60-year project, really. I mean, a 60-year project to get to a new normal that for a brief period of time, there was this, maybe 5-year period, maybe even where there was a rejiggering of power, and then a 60-year program to sort of get it back to a new equilibrium that wasn't that durable. I mean, I guess, that's the encouraging part.
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean,
help me out here.
I mean, it's hard because I think part of it is that we have to sit with the hard, dark truth of white supremacy and the investments in it. And not only by white conservatives in the South, but white conservatives in the North and West too. White Southerners couldn't have done what they did without the sort of support of white Northerners and Westerners. And so,
even if it's just tacit support. If you create that vacuum, if you don't enter into that fight, you've created a vacuum. That's basically it.
Exactly. But you also have things like northern states saying after with the 15th Amendment, is this going to apply to my state? Like, I'm in Michigan. So it would be the equivalent of Michigan saying, is this going to apply to us? The 15th Amendment shouldn't apply to us. We didn't secede from the war.
Right.
I mean, we didn't secede from the country. And so, you've got these larger national investments in white supremacy that I think we haven't been honest about. We haven't come to terms with it. And I think a lot of Northerners and Westerners, we acknowledge the lost cause of the South, but we don't acknowledge that white Northerners and Westerners have created their own mythology, right? And in the Northern states, it's we're all abolitionists, and they weren't. If they had all been abolitionists, they could have abolished slavery before. They could have abolished slavery at any time before the war. But that's not who they were.
Right. And reminder: there was not a push to abolish slavery. I mean, it wasn't as instrumental to the economy in the way that it was to the South. The Southern slavery may have been, but the real, like, to the extent that there was any active anti-slavery or abolition, it was really in inhibiting its growth in the new Western territories.
In the Western states.
It wasn't about existing slavery at that point.
Exactly.
And we should also say, like, people could be abolitionists, and very often were, without really, whose solution to slavery was send all black people back to Africa.
Exactly. They can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Right.
And I think that we, again, this is where we again need to grapple with the hard truth of investments in white supremacy and how white supremacy works. The subtle, like there's the sort of hard fist of white supremacy, and there's the soft, right, behind the scenes support for the same outcome, if not a willingness to sort of get out there and be on the front lines. And I think what I tried to do in the book was to help readers see how that works through violence and through support of the violence and refusal to do anything about the violence, and how that makes our democracy less secure. And, maybe even to serve as a warning for the reality that we're facing today.
Well, it's an incredibly important book. Kidada E. Williams, Associate Professor of History at Wayne State University. The book is I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We'll put a link to that, obviously, in the podcast, YouTube, and website. Will be on majority.fm. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.